Hi, it's Matt. I've got another 7 by 10 inch transparent watercolor to share with you today. This bird's a pretty unusual one to find in my home state of Michigan, but I got photo reference for this painting when we were on a family birding trip to the Everglades. To keep my watercolor paper in pristine condition, I do all of my sketching and problem solving in a sketchbook, and then I transfer only the main lines of my drawing to the watercolor paper using some tracing paper. I used liquid frisket to mask off the bird and the palm tree so I could wash in a background. I almost always avoid white backgrounds. In this one I wanted it to be very soft and light, but with a slight gradation from a light blue-gray to almost white at the bottom. Some good tips for getting a smooth wash are tilting your paper or your desk so gravity is going to help pull the pigment down the page. Keeps the wet edge moving. Another tip is to premix all of your pigments for a gradient before you start a wash. This saves having to try mixing colors when your paper is starting to dry. A soft lighting effect, I pre-wet my paper making sure it was evenly wet. Generally when starting a wash, it's best to put your lightest colors at the top of the page and have the darker portions toward the bottom. This works because as the pigment gets pulled down the page by gravity, it tends to collect and get darker at the bottom as it puddles there. In this case, I brought in the darker colors first, and then I just flipped the paper over. To prevent any back runs and darker shading near the frisket, I sucked up the extra wash with twisted up tissue and some dry number 2 round brushes. Once things were evenly wet, I started streaking in some greens to suggest some blurred out palm leaves in the background. Since these went into the wet background, those should end up having very soft edges. Once all the soft edge work was done, I hit everything with the hairdryer to lock in the colors. Then I suggested some quick background leaves with a number 2 and number 6 brushes. Once those were drawn in, I hit it with a hairdryer and I peeled off liquid frisket. With the white of the paper showing again, I transferred the rest of my sketch to the paper. For a palette, most of the time I was using a butcher's tray to mix, and I also had my initial wash colors still in the porcelain well plate nearby so I could grab pigments from those too. At this point, my immediate goal was to cover the white of the paper and get in all of the lightest local colors for all the foreground images on the page. As you can see, that butcher's tray is great because it has a lot of space, and the color you see on that tray is exactly the color you get when you put it on the page. I tend to clean off my tray before I start my painting, and then occasionally I'll swipe off an area here or there to clean it up if I need a really fresh pigment. Otherwise, it can be nice to use some of those other pigments that are still on the tray. Just re-wet them and use those exactly where you need them on your painting. In this painting, it actually had a somewhat limited palette. For greens, I was doing a lot of mixing. For my saturated greens, I was using phthalo green with lemon yellow in differing amounts. When I wanted to push that in a warm direction, I added a little chrome orange. To desaturate my greens, I was adding cadmium red medium and occasionally some permanent alizarin crimson. And for my shadow areas, I bring in some dioxazine purple or phthalo blue. For my browns and tans, those were mixes of lemon yellow, chrome orange, and whatever greens were on my butcher's tray, and then some dioxazine purple. I'd say that 98% of the rest of the painting was done with that same number 2 round brush. I was told ages ago that watercolor brushes lasted forever. Yeah. If only that were true. I wear them out. A number 2 synthetic fake sable brush like this will last for 4 to 5 paintings that are 7 by 10 inches. And at that point it starts losing its sharpness and I don't use it anymore. I'll take out a new brush. I think all those tiny little brush strokes that I'm using to build textures like bark and fur or feathers, it just wears out the fine tips on the brushes. And after a bazillion strokes, that hair just gets worn down. A large brush like a number 4 or a number 6, those last a lot longer because I'm not using it for all that detail work. Investing in that cool gray desaturated background looks like it will pay off because it's going to really help the warm colors of the palm and the warbler to pop off the page. I wasn't really looking much at my photo reference on this painting because I took the photo through a window and it had really lousy contrasty color. It had little definition to look at, very lousy detail. And on top of that, it had a harsh backlit white background. With so many things going against that photo, why bother painting it? Well, first, I tend to leave my best photos as photos, and I don't paint them. I leave it as a photograph and enjoy it. I tend to usually paint photos that I had taken. I paint from the ones that were missing something special, the photo that was almost great, And so in this case, there was a lot missing from my photo reference, but what drew me to the photo was that it had this great energy in the pattern of the leaves, and it had a fun pose to the bird. Plus yellow-throated warblers, they just seem like undeniably classy little birds. What I liked was the potential of the palm tree and the bird to move your eye around the page. Those palm leaves really seem to set up a great rhythm of lights and darks. I accentuated the thick green mass with the gaps of the sky on the left as they transitioned over to the long wispy fronds and mostly sky on the right. There were a lot of interesting diagonals that divided up the page into patches of patterns, and all of those elements just seemed to be echoed by the tiny little striations on every little leaf. And then when you finally get to it, the bird with its wings have the same patterns of stripes and stacked feathers like the palm fronds and little streaks on the belly that were also stripy. Everything just seemed to work together. I think a lot of what makes things look interesting are all the imperfections, like on the leaves and the branches. And it was really fun to paint. It was interesting to play with those transitions from healthy to browned up leaves to move your eye along one portion of the page or one leaf. And I ended up faking in a lot of details because the photo was bad, and you kind of select which areas should be browned up and which areas should be more green. For the shaded areas, I was bringing in a lot of phthalo blue and dioxazine purple to darken things. For the darkest areas of the browned up leaves, some streaks of permanent alizarin crimson and dioxazine purple made for some elements that gave some depth while still relating back to the other shadow areas. To build the depth of texture, I ended up going over all the detailed areas dozens of times with different glazes, getting slightly darker and more opaque as I went. And all those layers, as they go on top of each other, build up a convincing depth. This again was one of those paintings where the background and the foliage took almost all the time and the bird just kind of got zipped in at the end. The bird's back, its rump, and the top of its head were all the same colors as the background, that kind of purpley gray. In this case, there's just a little bit less water added to those purple grays. Again, the shadows on the bird's white underside, those were mostly painted with dioxazine purple and phthalo blue, with some reflected greens of the palm tree brought in. You can see how contrasty my photo was at this point. It's not great, but it was a fun photo to leap off from. For some of the tiniest details like eyes, beaks, and feet, I ended up switching over to a 10-aught brush. That's the orange-handled paintbrush that you see. As my eyes get older, I'm also using a magnifier for those tiny parts. Vision isn't what it used to be. Sometimes I'm baffled about where I'm going to hide my signature. Typically, I don't like putting them out in the open. I like hiding them in maybe the bark of a branch or some leaf litter or something like that. So I settled on sneaking it in on the leaf that was coming in along the left at the bottom. And as usual, I always end up finding a dozen or more things to fix after I've signed the piece. And often after I scan it, I have it on the computer and I look at it differently and say, you know, I've got to change that. And instead of cleaning up the scanner dust, I end up going and painting for another half hour or so. So once I had all those little things done, I called it quits. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate it.